University campuses across Canada have played host to a growing number of protests since the start of the Israel-Hamas war, in some cases leading to student-on-student violence.
A 22-year-old female student was arrested for assaulting a campus security guard.
I hope you die.
We don't get no justice, then they don't get no peace.
They don't. Let go!
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be a timely and important conversation. I'm Amanda Ashkenazi, Director of Education for HR Canada Charitable Organization. We're a national educational charity dedicated to advancing public understanding of anti-Semitism and the cultural narratives that shape public discourse surrounding it through research, educational programming, and public dialogue. Tonight, we're turning our attention to one of the most pressing issues facing Canadian society today: the rise of anti-Semitism on university campuses, and the broader questions that it raises about academic freedom, institutional responsibility, and the future of open inquiry. While the events of the past 2.5 years have brought these issues into sharp focus, the challenges extend far beyond any single campus or controversy. They speak to the health of our democratic institutions and our ability to engage thoughtfully, even in profound disagreement. We're honored tonight to be joined by Shabbos Kestenbaum, one of the leading voices on campus anti-Semitism, whose advocacy has helped bring international attention to the experiences of Jewish students and the responsibilities of universities in responding to hate and discrimination. Shabbos became nationally recognized after filing a landmark lawsuit against Harvard University, alleging that they failed to protect Jewish students from a pervasive anti-Semitic harassment on their campus. Since then, he's become a leading advocate for accountability in higher education, testifying before the US Congress, and speaking internationally about the crisis unfolding on university campuses. Moderating tonight's conversation is Greg Brady, host of Toronto Today with Greg Brady on AM 640, and one of Canada's most respected radio broadcasters. Greg brings years of experience facilitating thoughtful conversations on complex and often contentious public issues. We're so excited to have you both here for this discussion, and I'll turn it over to you now, Greg.
It's a great pleasure, Amanda, and thank you very much for the introduction. We're certainly looking forward to having a conversation. I want to personally thank HR Canada Charitable for asking me to be involved in this. And had I known the topic before seeing the email ask, anti-Semitism on campuses, university and college issues, I'm in the heart of that right now as a parent. I've got a second son. I've got 2 kids, and my second will go to Brock University in St. Catharines this fall. My other son is in 3rd year now at Western and started basically in university 11 months after October 7th. So he's seen some things on campus at Western and seen some things that have been encouraging in terms of a response to the anti-Semitism, and he's also seen some things that have been rather concerning that I don't think anybody should see, let alone an 18 or 19-year-old on campus. Some of the imagery and some of the discussions. So I was very eager. I leapt at the opportunity to have this conversation. And saying that, it is me here as a role of moderator, but our guest is, of course, he doesn't need an introduction, but that introduction that you gave, Amanda, is a stellar one. He's been an important voice on this front ever since October 7th, and pretty much in the immediate aftermath of the October 7th attacks. So let me welcome all the way from Israel today, Shabbos Kestenbaum. It's great to have that conversation. I know we connected beforehand, but we're doing it with in real time right now, and I appreciate the opportunity to have a chat with you.
Yeah, pleasure is all mine. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Let me lay that out and sort of what I saw as a parent, you saw firsthand as a younger person. You're, not even 25 years old on October 7th, 2023. I want to start there and then get into what happened with you at Harvard, why you felt it absolutely necessary, not just to find your voice, but to utilize it to the maximum potential of it. And then, of course, where we are right now. So where are you the morning of Saturday, October 7th, and take us through that next 24 hours, probably knowing that your life on campus and many campuses across North America wouldn't be the same again, Chavez?
Yeah, that's a terrific question because so much of myself, be it politically, be it religiously, be it culturally, changed dramatically in essentially a 24-hour period. So I always make this distinction that often people get upset with. So bear with me. The story of October 7th is not really the story of October 7th because Hamas, for example, is a dictatorial, tyrannical regime that should be obliterated from the face of the earth. They, of course, throw homosexuals off of roofs. They have totally obliterated the emancipation of women. They don't believe, obviously, in religious freedom, movement, free expression. However, terrorists definitionally commit acts of terrorism. It's what they do. Hassan Nasrallah, the since deposed head of Hezbollah, had stated for years that his desire would be for all the Jews of the world to pack up and move to Israel, because in his own words, it would be so much more convenient to kill you in one location than having to hunt you down country to country. So again, terrorism is bad, but definitionally, when they commit acts of terrorism, it's almost to be expected. Obviously, on this scale, it was almost unimaginable. But I always make this distinction of the story of October 7th is really October 8th. And what do I mean by that is, to answer your question, I was at Harvard Chabad, which is one of the main institutions of Jewish life on campus. It's really the Chabad and the Hillel. And rumors begin to circulate. There was a bombing. No, there was a stabbing. No, there was a shooting. I'm an Orthodox Jew, so I'm not using my phone on Shabbat or the holidays. And in an almost sick, cynical way, growing up, as you said, I'm a young person, having a modern state of Israel in the 20th and now 21st century means that there is terrorism. Again, we don't like it, but it's par for the course. I lived in the old city of Jerusalem for 2 years. I studied at Aish Torah, and one of our rabbis was actually stabbed to death by a Palestinian terrorist outside of Shar Yafo, Jaffa Gate, in the old city of Jerusalem. So when we heard there was a terrorist attack, yeah, we're sorry. That's terrible. But yeah, of course there's a terrorist attack. The problem was, as the night went on, or the day went on, the rumors persisted, the rumors strengthened, and it became readily apparent that what we young American Jews, really what we young Jews across the world, were now experiencing was something we had never experienced before. And that is Israel as an existential issue. Israel, where its legitimacy, its survival, and yes, its like actual existence is now a question mark. We don't relate to Israel that way. Again, I was 4 years old during the Second Intifada. I was not alive during the First Lebanon War. I was not alive 73, 67, Suez Canal, 48. I relate to Israel as a place where my grandparents live, where I might live one day, where I go for a Passover vacation, a country I'm proud to support. But you don't question its legitimacy in the same way you don't question the legitimacy of like Portugal. It would just be a bizarre thing to do. And we were faced overnight with a new reality of actually we are questioning its legitimacy because will the state of Israel literally survive? And so the reason I say the story is not October 7th, it's not Hamas and Hezbollah, it's the story of October 8th, because my story really begins, and the story of hundreds of thousands of young Jews across college campuses, really across the world, is that our allies, our friends, our supporters, people we sat in classes with, even our professors. And I'll get a little political just briefly. I was on the left of the political spectrum, so I took knees for Black Lives Matter. I was in an environment at Harvard where people were introducing themselves with preferred gender pronouns. I marched at the Supreme Court when Roe v. Wade was overturned, which was the constitutional protection that guaranteed abortion access to women. And on the night of October 7th, as those people that I just described, the very elite, progressive, educated, sensitive, tolerant, as they're watching the images in real time on live TV of Jewish women like Naama Levy bleeding from their private areas, as they're watching the images in real time on live TV of Jewish babies like Fir and Ariel Bibas being hoarded onto motorcycles by strangers and deported into Gaza, as they're watching the images on live TV in real time of these mangled, charred bodies of teenagers at a music festival, the immediate reaction of 34 student groups at Harvard, from the Feminist Society to the Muslim Association, the immediate reaction of those groups was to jump out of bed. Some were still in their pajamas, to draft what they called an emergency statement to blame Jews for the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust as it was happening. That, therefore, at least to me, is the story of October 7th. It's these individuals that we believed were friends with, that we marched with, we voted for, we allied ourselves with, and they were quite literally the first ones to call for the eradication of Western civilization. They were the first ones to champion calls for an intifada. They were the first ones to celebrate in Harvard WhatsApp groups that I can show you all screenshots of, to celebrate what was happening as it was happening. And that is something that will stick with me probably for the rest of my life. I will not be able to forget, and I certainly will not be able to forgive.
That's where I think in the few days after that happens, I think there were two big factors that are very eerie and very rattling to anybody, even a non-Jew like myself, is the idea that Hamas knew how the Western media would react, and maybe as importantly, maybe more, how the reaction would be in the education system and on campuses. And I had somebody tell me that probably, Shabazz, we had Canadian Thanksgiving up here, so I wasn't going back on the air until Monday, or rather Tuesday the 10th. So we had a lot of time to process this and figure out what do we say? Where will this be Tuesday morning after we wake up to these images, having our morning coffee Saturday? I probably saw some of the media aspects of this, to your point, and you were living it in real time. I didn't see the campus reaction. Did it surprise you when we're sitting there October 9, 10, 11, 12, and exactly that? It's not just a reverb effect. It is, you know whose fault this is, don't you? Like, I didn't see that coming, but you were living it and I wasn't. Did it surprise you?
Yeah, again, great question. The answer I always give is relatively succinct, but it's relatively consistent, which is I was shocked, but I actually wasn't surprised, because this is decades and decades of political indoctrination masquerading itself as intellectual discourse and academic worth, when it is literally nothing other than a deep-seated hatred against the Jewish state and an almost obsession against the Jewish people. And when it's funny, when the Palestinian movement says, well, this didn't start on October 7th, in a similar way, the anti-Semitism on campuses did not start on October 7th either. So there were classes, I talk about this openly, that I took or friends took at Harvard. I'll give you just three quick examples. One was called Religion and Peace, the Case of Israel-Palestine. The professor gets up on the first day of class. This is fully corroborated by a former classmate of mine, Itzan Plitman. She wrote an article about this in Haaretz. And the professor gets up on the first day and she says, look, in politics, in media, in academia, the Zionist narrative is the dominant narrative, which isn't true. Therefore, to understand both sides of the story, we in this class, which again, Greg, is called Religion and Peace, the Case of Israel-Palestine, will not study, will not read, will not learn, will not discuss any texts if they were written by Israelis. This was a class that was taught for years at Harvard. There was another class that I took called Religion and Nationalism, again, the Case of Israel-Palestine, because almost all their classes are on Israel-Palestine. They're obsessed. And in this class, we were taught literally as fact that historically the Jew has been powerless. And with the advent of the state of Israel in the 21st century, the only way the Jew knows how to exhibit and exert their newfound power is, in fact, by internalizing the ways of Nazi Germany, which is how you students can now appreciate why the IOF, the Israeli occupying forces, are so Gestapo-esque in their tactics. And for the final paper, which was worth, I don't know, maybe 50% of the grade, I added an epilogue to my paper. I lied through my teeth, and I denounced the religious Zionist values I had grown up with. And it was the only paper at Harvard that actually got an A+ on. And it was not a very good paper. I don't think they were rewarding me for the substance. I think they were rewarding me for the ideological uniformity, which is ubiquitous across so many of these campuses. And one last example I'll give you is a class called Narratives and Displacement, the Case of Israel-Palestine. And this is a class where they actually take you to what they call Palestine. I say it's what they call Palestine because like the Palestine they take you to is like Ben Yehuda Street in Jerusalem, which is not contested territory at all. It's Israel proper, but they pretend it's, controversial. And many people apply because, again, at Harvard, the only issue people seem to really grasp with is Israel-Palestine. And I apply because I thought it was really important that my professors and my classmates knew that I am not this misogynistic, insular, Orthodox Jew you surmise I must be, because I was the only Jew at my program. I was the only person at my program who wore a yarmulke, who kept kosher, kept Shabbat, and there were a lot of misconceptions and stereotypes about my community. And so during this interview, because you have to apply, it's very competitive, the professors who actually knew me from the prior course, they had said, Shabbos, we're really, we've never had someone like you apply before. I said, I don't know if you mean because, I wear a yarmulke. I don't know if that means because I don't believe in nuking Israel off the map. And I said, it's so important I go on this trip because in my Orthodox community, we're not really allowed to discuss Palestine, which is not true at all, but that's what my professors wanted to hear. So they said, look, we're really concerned. I said, why are you concerned? And They said, this is all before October 7th. They said, we're concerned because if we take you to Palestine, which again is Israel proper, I read the itinerary, nothing about where they go is Palestine, and we show you the ethnic cleansing, we show you the genocide, we show you the apartheid, we show you the Jewish supremacy through the process of unlearning, which is a term monumentously stupid, but I digress. You will be so psychologically traumatized from that trip. You will not be able to reassociate yourself back with the Jewish day school, back with your Jewish synagogue, back with the Jewish summer camp, because you'll have realized Shabbos for 23, 24 years. Your rabbis, your educators, even your parents have been feeding you a diet of political indoctrination. We, as your professors, we don't want to be held responsible for that psychological trauma, so they rejected me from the program. And these were like normal everyday classes that were taught for years. So when you ask me, am I surprised? I'm shocked because it's hard to get those images out of my head of like classmates and friends literally celebrating 10/7. But this is the ultimate outcome. This was almost inevitable. When you teach courses where you encourage students not how to think, but what to think, yeah, you're going to end up with some pretty shocking conclusions.
And I want to take that to your action against Harvard, but I'll fill in the gap for me and maybe listeners of my vintage, kind of born in the early 70s, grew up in the 80s, was in university in the 90s. I took an evening class simply titled Middle East Politics at what was then University of Western Ontario in London. And it was the best way I can put it, Shabbos, is it was a political free-for-all. We had an Egyptian professor. I thought he was great. I thought he was dynamic. But guess what? He stimulated a lot of vocal conversation and a lot of disagreement when we'd get into issues surrounding Israel, issues surrounding Palestine, certainly the other Arab states as well, haven't always gotten along. We were only several years removed from the Iran-Iraq war. We were a couple years removed from the United States and the first Gulf War under George Herbert Walker Bush. So my point in comparing your experience to mine is, I wish that you could have had my experience. I want my own kids to have my experience. And I'm worried we've just pushed the needle too far, where people would get upset at each other, but this would be a normal political conversation about issues, about political leaders, about political parties. What never came up in those conversations in 1993, 94 were, well, should the Jews have their own state? Should Israel even exist? Like, not in a million years would that have happened. And we fast forward. Yeah, like, I get it. It's 3 decades almost. But Shabbos, that's the scary place we're in now. And we're still having these conversations almost 3 calendar years after the attacks.
Yeah, I think what you just said about does it have a right to exist? I always found that question so funny. We do talk about Israel's right to exist simply because our ideological adversaries always say they don't have a right to exist. So that's why we talk about it. But in general, whether it has a right to exist or not, I mean, it does for historical reasons, for cultural reasons, for religion. I mean, we can get into that later, but it exists. So it's irrelevant whether you believe it should, because it does. This idea that a nation state in contemporary society can simply cease to exist due to outside political pressure is a bizarre fiction concocted by the most out of touch, Ivy League elites on these campuses. This idea that this is even a debate, I find just remarkable. And it's, again, really a manifestation of how removed so many of these alleged intellectuals are from like practical or pragmatic geopolitics. But to make a broader point, which is what you're touching upon, I won't get too political, but I became a conservative. I'm on a political evolution of sorts. And Charlie Kirk taught me, and he taught millions of people really, that you combat bad ideas with better ideas, not with censorship. And I think this is where, at least in the United States, it sets me apart from some of the Jewish establishment, because I actually don't believe that the solution to having an anti-Semitic speaker is to ban them from campus. I don't think the solution to, hateful rhetoric is to ban the hateful rhetoric. Number one, it's just counterintuitive, like moths to a flame. If you ban the thing, then everyone will be attracted to, ooh, what's the thing you can't say? What's the question you can't ask? So number one, it just doesn't work. But number two, again, if I'm very comfortable and convinced and confident of my political positions and of my ideology, and if I'm not able to withstand a speaker who I believe is void of facts and logic, then am I really that confident in my political persuasion? The problem with Harvard and so many of these campuses, particularly in Canada, actually, is the double standard. So I just told you, Greg, that hateful speakers should be allowed on campus because this is the marketplace of ideas, and tell them why they're wrong. And if you can't do that on a college campus, like where else can you do it? The problem is the double standard. What do I mean by that? Harvard has what's called mandatory Title IX training. Title IX is a provision that is essentially anti-discrimination. It's a federal law. And so they will tell students, and they have told students. I don't know if they still do it post 10/7 because of all the backlash, but at least historically, they told incoming students that fat phobia, that ableism, that transphobia is grounds for discipline and even dismissal. Harvard University was ranked 241st out of 241 American universities. Sorry, 248th. They ranked 248th out of 248 American universities by the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expressions, which is an American NGO that documents American universities' commitments to free speech and the First Amendment. Harvard was ranked dead last. This is a university that unenrolled 12 admitted students when it turns out they had posted a sexist meme in a private WhatsApp group. This is a university that demoted an African-American professor for coming out against Black Lives Matter. This is a university that demoted another African-American professor for fulfilling his legal obligations as a lawyer to represent a client, Harvey Weinstein, that students objected to. This is a university that continuously disinvites speakers who are deemed transphobic or misogynistic. So they don't have a track record of doing the thing I just said that universities should do, of like bad ideas, better ideas. So what makes it really weird is my first month of being a student at Harvard, the Harvard-Palestine Solidarity Committee, which I always joke is the largest compilation of intellectually challenged morons I've ever met in my life, they decide to invite Muhammad El-Kurd to come speak on campus. Now, Muhammad is someone who has said that Jews eat the organs of Palestinians. Muhammad has said that we have to, quote, normalize massacres against Jews. Muhammad has lamented how Palestinians can no longer hijack planes anymore. He says on Twitter that all Zionists must perish. So we go to the Harvard board, we go to the president at the time, Larry Bacow, and we say, look, you have this track record of disciplining speech you don't like in the name of like making sure minorities feel safe and welcomed and, good about themselves. Whether that's a good policy or not is irrelevant because that's your policy. Again, I already explained, I don't think it's a good policy, but that's the policy you do. Why don't you apply that logic to someone who is so vehemently anti-Semitic? He has quite literally appeared on the Anti-Defamation League's like top 10 anti-Semites, which is like pretty impressive when you think about it, considering how much competition there is to get on that list. Like not even Candace Owens made it on that list that year. And Harvard did something remarkable. They kind of like shrugged their shoulders and they said, well, he's a First Amendment right. What do you want us to do about it? That's the double standard. You can't say that we are going to rescind and regulate speech that we find offensive, except when it comes to speech and behavior that is offensive and anti-Semitic to Jewish people. You can't do that. That's a double standard. That's discriminatory. And as we proved in court, it's illegal. It's anti-Semitic. And again, if you want to have a policy of we're going to discipline speech through and through, then you have to be consistent. If the policy is we're not going to discipline any speech, which I would support, then you have to be consistent. The problem with so many of these universities after October 7th is it just became obvious that they had a double standard by which they treated all students and by which they treated Jewish students. And perhaps the best example of this is that fateful December 6, 2023 congressional hearing where Congresswoman Elise Stefanik of New York, who's just excellent, a friend of mine and a real voice of moral clarity, she asks the presidents of the three leading morally bankrupt institutions, Claudine Gay of Harvard, Sally Kornblue of MIT, and Liz McGill of Penn, do the calls for genocide violate Harvard's code of conduct? By the way, spoiler alert, as someone who's like obsessively read the code of conduct, it absolutely does. Sure. And I'll tell you guys, a little secret. That was not meant to be a trick question. That was not meant to be a gotcha moment. The trick question was meant to be the follow-up, which is now that you've all said, yes, of course it violates our code of conduct, how come you've allowed the calls for genocide on your campus? That was meant to be like, oh, got him. And Congresswoman Stefanik was so caught off guard by their answers, it depends on the context, that she asked them again. Watch the tape. It's the most watched congressional testimony in American history, 2 billion views and counting. And she says, and I quote, "This is a softball question. I'll give you a second chance to respond." And one after the other say, no, really, we promise it depends on the context. We know that they would never say that about any other group because they haven't said about any other group. They've taken the opposite approach with every other group. But when it came to Jews, it was like, yeah, it depends. And I remember watching that testimony live. I was in my apartment and I, bang on the desk and I say, aha, you see, I told you. Because for basically 3 months, I had been trying to make the case that Jews are treated qualitatively different than other groups on campus. And I was consistently told I'm exaggerating. This is free speech. This is just anti-Zionism. And now you have the president of Harvard University, Claudine Gay, admitting that what I was saying was true. So Claudine Gay became the best advocate for Jewish students on campus through her own sheer incompetence. It was really remarkable to watch that in real time.
I also, as you say that, I can't think of any example in the last, again, 30 years since close to 30 years since I was an undergrad, that they would have had to, any school, any university, any college in North America would have even been charged with not being able to protect a certain ethnicity or nationality. You can think about all the conflicts. Again, the 80s were all about South Africa, apartheid. There's no way that a South African student would have come to a Harvard, a school in Canada, a Western, a McGill, a University of Toronto, and been harassed and discriminated against. Because think about a Russian student now, and we don't even ask the question, nor should we. Hey, should Russia exist? Should we get rid of all the Russians? Should Russia even be a thing? We can have strong opinions about all the international conflicts we're in the midst of right now and over the last couple decades. To your point, this is the one, and this has made my voice, I think, louder as well since October 7th to go, we don't hold any other religion or culture responsible for even perceived or perceived rightly or wrongly, actions of a government. We don't do it. We never have. We never should. We make an exception, it seems like, in our society in the Western world right now for the Jews in Israel. And that gets a lot of people's blood boiling, as you might expect, and you would know.
100%. I love that. It's such an important point. And in fact, I was banned. Bear with me. I was banned from China for 3 years because I did a lot of, when I was in my 20s. I still am in my 20s. When I was 20, I organized rallies of solidarity outside of the United Nations and outside of the White House with Uyghurs, who are an ethnic Muslim minority in the Xinjiang province of China, who really are facing a genocide. They're put into internment camps. Many of the women go through forced sterilization. And so I said, as a Jewish person, solidarity, and we're with you. And so the Chinese Communist Party put me on a blacklist. I mean, that's like a real thing that actually happened. It never in my life ever crossed my mind. It had never occurred to me, whether at Harvard, whether on the subway, whether in my daily routine, to ask Chinese people, hey, before, I get you this coffee, before we sit down and talk, you denounce your government, right? You publicly, I need you to go on your social media and say that the CCP is committing a genocide. It never even occurred to me. And by the way, at Harvard, I would actually have legitimate credibility to ask that because there are actual Chinese Communist Party members at Harvard University. In fact, this is a tangent, but there was an article from the Wall Street Journal about 6-7 months ago, and it showed that there's so many Chinese Communist Party officials at the Harvard Kennedy School, which is the School of Government and Public Policy, that the CCP quite literally referred to Harvard as, quote, their party school. So I would actually be entitled to ask Chinese students at Harvard, hey, do you announce the CCP? Because then I actually work for the CCP. But it would never occur to me because you treat an individual as an individual. Be a mensch. Like that's what Ben Shapiro says, like be a mensch. But when it comes to Jewish students, and in particular Israeli students, they have to go through a litmus test. They have to denounce a whole criteria of politics and policies before they will be accepted. And in fact, the Harvard Antisemitism Task Force, when they finally released their report after basically more than a year of political pressure, it showed the horrific levels of discrimination against Israeli students stretching way before October 7th. One quick example is at the Kennedy School. A professor pairs up the students for a group project. And one of the students gets up and says, Professor, you made a mistake because you paired me up with an Israeli student. And I don't work with Israelis. And you know what the professor said? The professor said, oh, I'm so sorry. Let me reassign you someone else. I mean, talk about discrimination based on national origin, which again is a violation of federal law. This was normalized. This was accepted, and it was literally celebrated. When I say celebrated, people like Zohar Mamdani, the mayor of New York City, his father, a professor at Columbia, was one of the leaders in the anti-normalization effort, which is to speak with, to debate, to befriend a Zionist is the ultimate betrayal of the Palestinian cause. So we had a producer of a major network show reach out shortly after 10/7, and he said, we want to do a live public debate on Harvard's campus between you, Shabbos, as the token pro-Israel Jew, and we'll get a token pro-Palestinian Muslim. I said, great, because this is what our country needs, modeling how we can disagree better. And it'll end in a handshake, a hug, you'll sing Kumbaya or whatever. You'll disagree, but you can disagree better. To this day, that debate has never been aired. It's never been filmed because we had not been able to find one pro-Palestinian student, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, who is willing to debate us because in their own words, we don't legitimize your worldview. We don't speak with Zionists. We don't normalize your rhetoric. So how exactly are you meant to proceed on a campus in a democratic society when half of the campus's starting position is the eradication of your people from the river to the sea, and they're not going to tell you why or engage in dialogue? That's really dangerous.
I really want to get to the cultural climate on Ivy League campuses and whether it's changing or whether universities are just getting better PR, as it were. But I want to ask you about the lawsuit itself. The night before you're about to file a lawsuit against this giant, iconic post-secondary institute, What's that like? What's that like? It like you must be jumpy, you must be buzzing. We all ask ourselves questions about, am I ready for this? Am I ready to take that job, quit that job, have a kid? I can't imagine what that sleep was like, knowing this is going to make some serious news here to push this forward.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the night before. Actually, I'm trying to remember, so I'll have to get back to you. But I do remember in the days leading up to it, ironically, I actually was in Israel for my sister's wedding. So that was pretty apropos, I would say, surrounded by, in the face of so much adversity and trauma and pain, surrounded with life. And I think that really represents the best of the Jewish people. But look, when we filed, there were, if I'm remembering correctly, five plaintiffs in total. I was the only named plaintiff, and it's not because I wanted everyone to know who I was. It's because I felt it was really important that at least one plaintiff have a name, simply because it was important for the American people to recognize these are not anonymous stories. These are not mere allegations. These are real people. These are American citizens who are being denied access to their education because of their religious identity. And again, I didn't want to be the guy because I just didn't want to be the guy. And I was hoping the other plaintiffs, one of them would be the guy, but none of us really wanted to be the guy. So I just decided kind of in the 11th hour, it was really important that we put a name and we put a face. And that means, yeah, if there's media who wants to ask questions about this case, that's a really important component, because we're not just fighting in the battlefronts of Gaza and Lebanon and Yemen and wherever. We're fighting in the battleground of ideas. We're fighting in the court of law just as much as we're fighting in the court of public opinion. We're fighting in the halls of Congress and the halls of power, in media, in social media. And my perspective kind of shifted that, hey, we're filing this lawsuit because we have been wronged, because we feel and we know that there's a violation of federal law. But also, this lawsuit represents a really powerful manifestation that not only did we do nothing wrong, but we're actually defending really important principles. Chief among them is religious freedom. You cannot be treated differently because of your religious practices, principles, and ideals. And Harvard was, in fact, treating us different because of that. So I was not aware at the time of just how radically my life would be transformed. I mean, really, the last 3 years have just been insane. I'm trying to articulate it and find a better adjective, but I just can't. It's just been insane. I did not expect really any of this to happen. But my life has really changed, and I'm very proud that if people Google my name, which don't, because you get a lot of bad stuff, but if they Google my name, I will forever be connected with standing up, not just for values pertaining to the Jewish people, but values pertaining to the American people. I remember speaking at a Trump rally once, and I had said in 1790, President George Washington, he writes a letter to the largest Jewish community in the United States, in Newport, Rhode Island. And he says, here in the United States, things will be different. We want you to come as children of Abraham and practice your religion freely. And in his own words, bigotry will be granted no sanction, persecution, no assistance. And I tell this, Trump rally, I said, how shocked and appalled and embarrassed would President Washington and Adams and Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Franklin, Hamilton be today to know that American Jews are being denied access to education because of their religious identity. And I'm really proud that I can be connected to that fight. And I'll even take it one step further, which might sound a little bizarre. President Franklin Roosevelt once said in 1932, judge me by the enemies I have made. And I'm really proud of the fact that people who burn American flags, people who burn Israeli flags, people who call for the death of America, who call for the eradication of Western civilization, I'm proud of the fact that they don't like me. I don't like death threats. I'm not encouraging death threats. But when I do get death threats, which unfortunately is quite often, it's almost like an affirmation that I'm doing the right thing. Because when someone sees me supporting Judeo-Christian values, someone sees me supporting Western civilization, and their visceral reaction is to threaten to kill me, that's a badge of honor that I'm so obviously doing the right thing, and I'm so obviously on the right track. Again, I don't like that I have to be involved in this, but if those guys, the Mehdi Hassans and the Tucker Carlsons and the Candace Owens, if they started speaking positively about me on their shows, I would be a little weirded out.
You're not the only one to take the intense heat off you for a second. There's probably 7 or 8 names in the media world, and I won't name them here. That's for the book. But if I and this probably stems from politics or even some of the pandemic policy during COVID restrictions, and I'm like, if I start agreeing with them or they start agreeing with me, now I've got to check myself. I don't want them to agree with me because it means something has the wiring has changed in me. Let me get to that cultural climate on campuses, and I know when we were chatting off this broadcast, we talked about how I feel like, from my perspective, so you tell me if I'm wrong, I'm happy to be wrong. The things that we saw in the first year and a half on U.S. campuses, specifically out on the West Coast, specifically Ivy League, Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania area, we're seeing less of. We're seeing less Jewish students held to this unbelievable standard of who they must be, what they must say, and yes, the harassment and intimidation. I think we're seeing less of it. Here's the problem. In Canada, and I know you visited a bunch of times, I'm not sure I see that. We've had huge problems in the two main Montreal campuses of McGill and Concordia. I'm sure many viewers have kids there or they're graduates of there and they're mortified. In Toronto as well, we've seen problematic things. I'll say, for the record, my son was considering going to what used to be Ryerson, that's now Toronto Metropolitan University. He changed his mind all of his own volition. And I'm being honest, my wife and I were relieved. We thought it was a powder keg going into that campus for visiting days and whatnot. So maybe you can address both those things. What you see in the States on campuses, whether it's changing, and whether or not we've got a distinct issue in Canada on campuses, universities, and otherwise. Sure.
Yeah, well, the good news, Greg, is you're not wrong. You've pretty accurately diagnosed the problem. So yeah, I'll start with America first, then I'll shift over to Canada.
Sure.
In the United States, this is just a fact. You can love the guy, you can hate the guy. But since President Donald Trump's reelection, we have seen a marked shift in terms of what we were seeing, to your point, in the, let's say, 12-month aftermath of October 7th. That is chiefly because he has done what the majority of American Jewish students were really asking Joe Biden to do, which is cut the federal funding. Cut it. You need to create some type of incentive structure whereby the universities recognize that this pattern of violations of federal law cannot be tolerated anymore. It just can't. And President Trump did that. He did it very, very quickly. And that made a massive difference. Deporting foreign students who violate our law, whether their name is Mahmoud Khalil or Jewy Jewstein, any individual who's not an American who has a foreign visa to study on an American campus, particularly some of the best American campuses, that's a privilege. It's not a right. And if you abuse that right by violating the law, you're out. And again, that's something we were begging the Biden administration to do, and they simply refused. They refused to lift a finger. So President Trump, federal freeze to Harvard University. I'll focus on Harvard. Federal freeze to Harvard University, deporting foreign students who violate the law, a crackdown on diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives on public universities. Private, you obviously can't, but public universities, you absolutely can. That made a difference. We have seen that the data supports this, whether it's from the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee. It has shown that physical assaults against Jewish students, for example, are down. I mean, markedly down, dramatically down, like 80, 90%. You will not see encampments happen again on these campuses. And it's not because the presidents of these universities suddenly recognize the errors of their ways. It's because they're scared to death of losing money. That's it. It's not rocket science. And I think what bothers me is I was saying this basically from October 8th onward. I'll put it this way, the expenditure of federal dollars is a representation of our values. So we are going to fund things because we think it's a net positive for society. And the moment that thing stops becoming a net positive for society, we're going to stop funding it. And there was a perverse incentive structure whereby the more you discriminated against Jewish students, the more money you got, because as Harvard President Alan Garber continues to say, hey, you're going to cut cancer research? You can't do that. He holds the American people hostage under this pseudo threat of, well, I guess we're not going to do life-saving chemotherapy anymore, which A, isn't true, but B, it's morally perverse. And in fact, President Eisenhower, shortly after Brown v. Board of Education, he told racist schools in the South, he said, essentially, if you don't have black kids in your class by Monday, say goodbye to any federal assistance. And the racist schools in the South who did not want to desegregate, they said, what about, poor 9-year-old white Billy? You're going to cut the federal school lunch program? You're not going to support him? What did he do? And President Eisenhower's response was, essentially, it's too damn bad. Make sure you have blacks in your class by Monday. And lo and behold, all of the racist schools had blacks in their class by Monday. And Harvard University is using the argument of the Jim Crow South, saying, you're going to cut federal funding? What the hell? You can't do that. What about all these, poor students? What about the STEM research? And the answer is it's too damn bad. Why is it that Harvard University is insisting on violating the rights of American Jewish students? The fault is not with President Trump for following the law. The fault is with Harvard University for violating the law. This all could have been avoided. It can still be avoided if these universities simply recognize that they must comply with the law. So we have seen a market shift. Things really are different. What you will not be able to see that differently because legislation and policy really can't address it is the cultural side. So you still have ingrained anti-Semitism, ingrained anti-Americanism, a massive focus on diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. That's something that you can only fight in the cultural space. You can't enact policies to really fight that. What you can say is, hey, believe whatever you want. You can't discriminate, though. That you can do, and Trump is doing it. But the attitudes will be very, very difficult to combat. And if anything, we're seeing that Gen Z is even more engrossed in those anti-Semitic attitudes. In terms of the Canadian university, so first of all, I'm really glad to talk about Canada because I have a big spot in my heart for the Canadian Jewish community, particularly in Toronto and in Montreal. I go there quite often, and any Jews watching, by all means, invite me. I really would love to come. I think it's a really special community. And I've spoken at, where have I spoken at? Concordia, McGill, I think U of T, I think McMaster's. I once actually had a meeting with 12 either university presidents or senior admin on Canadian campuses, and I told them my story, and we spoke about ways that I felt they really had to fix. So big shout out to the Canadian Jewish community. It's way worse. It's way worse than the American campuses. I mean, I was shocked, really, really shocked. In fact, I think it was McGill, almost positively. No, it was Concordia. It was Concordia. I went with two friends of mine. I won't mention their names, but two friends of mine who brought me to their campus. And it was the day after the encampment leaders, in response to, I don't even know what, knelt down and started ripping up the grass on the lawn and just started flinging the grass all over the quad in, solidarity with Palestine or whatever. Canadian students have shown me the classrooms where they were physically assaulted in. Canadian Jewish students have shown me the pepper spray canisters they now carry. Canadian Jewish students have shown me the apps on their phone where they can alert not the Canadian police, but Canadian Jewish, volunteer services as to where their location is. I have spoken at Canadian synagogues, particularly in Toronto, that have been shot at, that have been defaced with swastikas. It's needless to say, without getting too much into the politics, but you have a government that has fundamentally rewarded terrorism, both practically in terms of dollars and also rhetorically by recognizing a Palestinian state without delineating any of its borders, without any conditions of releasing hostages, for example. You have a government that stands very squarely on the side of anti-Western, anti-democratic, and anti-Jewish forces. So I don't want to be too negative, and I'm not Canadian, so take this with a grain of salt. But when I speak to Canadian Jews, young Canadian Jews on campuses, and I'm happy to continue speaking to young Canadian Jews on campuses, I often tell them fighting back does not necessarily mean you stay where you are and you argue with individuals who don't believe in your right to exist. Fighting back can manifest in many different ways. And some of those ways can be putting on a Star of David necklace, can be marrying a Jewish person and building a beautiful, wonderful Jewish life. And that doesn't necessarily have to be in Canada. And I know anecdotally, and you of course know this far more than I, but anecdotally, a lot of young Canadian Jews are not planning on staying in Canada. And I don't actually think that's a bad thing. I think Canada has made it quite clear that they at best don't really want their Jewish constituents. And at worst, they have made it clear that they actually denigrate and scorn and humiliate all of the values that the Canadian Jewish community holds dear. And obviously there are exceptions, Melissa Lantsman, Pierre Poilievre, being perfect examples, but those are the exceptions to the rule, unfortunately. And so I would encourage Canadian Jewish students to recognize that you are much better. You are much better than individuals on your campus who burn Canadian flags, who have shut down campus space, have told you to go back to Poland. You're much better than those people because you're Jewish, because you're Canadian. You're much better than them. And I would encourage you to focus on elevating, amplifying, and living the best version of you that you can possibly do and live, and not necessarily responding to individuals whose IQs are in the single digits.
Yeah, I wish I could push back and go, no, you're not seeing what I'm seeing, but I am in this country, and I'm in the Toronto area, and I've heard the stories, and they're horrific. Again, we talk about the isolation over politics. That can happen. We can all have political disagreements. That's not what this is. You've got Jewish student groups who have to hire private security and keep an event location entirely secret to make sure they aren't targeted or disrupted or a bomb threat. And even at Toronto Metropolitan University, there have been 2 violent incidents just last academic year. So you can't blame kids, to your point, for wanting to be somewhere else. I get how frustrating it is. Like, why should they win? I just want to go to school, get a degree, have some fun, hang out. That feels like it's shifted, and I think there's a lot of kids and faculty, no less. I should mention them, who who would love to wind back the clocks or see what you're seeing in the United States and note there's a fear of deportation, there's a fear of funding being pulled, there's a fear of a bunch of different things. They're not seeing it in Canada. So your experience is exactly mine. And Jewish residents continue to be huge targets of hate crimes. It's gone up. It's gone up every year since the 23-24 academic year. And now it just feels normalized, and that's no good.
Yeah, that's kind of the problem. It's not necessarily that there's anti-Semitism, because the history of the Jew is that there's always been anti-Semitism. But what has been markedly different within Western societies, particularly North America, particularly the United States, is the adults in the room, the leadership, they hate it. And like, how can we combat this? How can we prevent this from happening again? Because this goes against who we are as a people, as a society, as a country. The problem that I see with the Canadian political framework is this has not just been normalized, but it's been accepted. And maybe I will get political. I don't know if you want me to, but your prime minister is a perfect architect of that. He has justified and legitimized and granted credibility to the worst elements of Canadian society. And I remember the day he recognized the state of Palestine. I was on Fox News, and I said, Palestine is not like Beetlejuice. You don't just say it 3 times and it magically appears. Countries and nation states require some semblance of responsibility. So what are the borders that you're delineating? Who's its leadership? What are the political concessions that you're going to demand of? And at the time, of course, those concessions should have been the releasing of the hostages, Hamas disarming, and of course, Mark Carney never demanded any of those things. And now we're more than a year out from that declaration of Canada recognizing the state of Palestine. Can Mark Carney articulate or point to any of the political concessions that Hamas has made? And the answer, of course, is no. Why is it that Mark Carney insists on accepting a radical, loud minority of migrants from countries that don't have strong histories of democracies, that don't have strong frameworks of multiculturalism or multi-religious societies, and he insists that we must bring them into our country? Why? I mean, you're destroying the social fabric of what made Canada, Canada. And of course, the first victims are Canadian Jews, because they're part of the fabric and they have patriotism and they have served in all roles, whether it's government or politics or media or academia. I mean, you name it. And they're the first ones bearing the brunt of this misguided migration policy, this misguided Palestine policy. And it's a shame. I was with a friend last night in Tel Aviv. I won't mention her name, but she's from Toronto. And I speak anecdotally, of course, but she's told me in no uncertain terms there's no way she sees herself living in this country. And that's a damning indictment on what that country has turned into. And it's self-imposed. That's perhaps what makes it so depressing. They've done this willingly, deliberately. And perhaps I should apologize, because had my president, Donald Trump, perhaps just kept his mouth shut during the elections, Pierre Poilievre might have been the prime minister, but I digress.
That has been discussed or theorized. There's no doubt about it that he got his preferred negotiating opponent. I'll put it that way. You were famously a Bernie Sanders supporter, registered Democrat, and it was obviously because of who you had become in the news cycle, as we mentioned with the lawsuit, to endorse Donald Trump. What was the exact point of no return? Were there weeks and months go by and you're like, the party that I think represents my values, surely they're going to wake up. Surely they're going to come to terms with what's right and wrong. Surely we can have political disagreements. They can hope there's a new leader in Israel, for example. They can hope for a lot of things, but they'll figure this out, and this won't be what many deem as now a boiling cauldron of anti-Semitism. You referenced the New York City mayor. There are clearly congressional candidates, senatorial candidates coming up for election who have, like archaic opinions about what America's and the West's relationship with Israel should be, regardless of who the leader is. What was that point of no return where you're like, they're not going to pick up the ball and run with it here? I'm out of here.
Well, first, let me just piggyback on a point you had mentioned, then I'll address the specifics of your question. Often, particularly in the left in America, they'll say, look, I want to support Israel, but it's the far right Bibi government. And once you replace Netanyahu, the reality is, I'm preaching to the choir here, but if Bibi was not prime minister after October 7th, whether it was Naftali Bennett, whether it was Yair Lapid, whether it was Benny Gantz, whoever it was, they would have orchestrated this war almost identically to the way that Bibi Netanyahu has orchestrated this war. Possibly they might have actually been more aggressive. So this idea that it's just Bibi we can't stand, it's total nonsense. And I I've only commented on Israeli politics once, and it got me into a lot of trouble. So I'll just keep it somewhat vague, and I'll just speak to the Israeli people by saying, and I actually had conversations this morning, if you think that the key to improving the eighth front of this ideological battle, if you think the key is getting rid of Bibi, then you are hopelessly misguided. Because whoever the prime minister is, it is ingrained on American campuses. It is ingrained within the American media cycle that Israel is a white settler, genocidal, apartheid colonial state. Whether the prime minister is Bibi Netanyahu or Mahmoud Abbas, that will not change. So that's just point number one.
Let me ask for the point on that. Let me ask for the point on that, because I think it's really worthy of clarifying and to get your opinion on it. Would you have? I agree with you that that's where it's at now. The cat's out of the bag. It doesn't matter who the prime minister is. The Israelis care. I mean, again, we all care about our politics. So people who have a link to the homeland care. People who visit there, who have relatives there, they sure care. The same way you do about your president, we do about our prime minister. I wouldn't have said what you just said, though, before October 7th. I wouldn't have said that because there were protests about the length of term for Netanyahu, the fact he'd come around the second time. Would you have looked at that on October 3rd, 2023, and said somebody deemed, at least by the media, as more moderate could, walk a finer line? I agree with you. The cat's out of the bag in the worst way, given the media reaction and obviously some of the intergovernmental reaction post October 7th.
Look, it's obviously a counterfactual question. So the short answer is maybe. I mean, who knows?
Yeah.
But to your point, I mean, cat's out of the bag, so at this point it's relevant. But yeah, on October 6th or 5th, I mean, I took part in the protests there. If you go to my social media and you scroll far enough, you'll see a picture of me holding a sign saying "Ein Demokratia im Kivush." There is no democracy with occupation. So I have political legitimacy to talk about the far left because I was part of the far left, and I have political legitimacy to talk about Israeli politics and the prime minister because I'm not. It's true, I'm not Israeli. I don't live in Israel, but I was involved. Now I said post 10/7, I'm more careful because Israelis, I think, misguidedly will say, well, you don't live there, so shut up. But I don't think that's a really strong argument because I have opinions on China. I don't live there. I mean, I rallied with the Uyghurs. Should I not have done that because I don't live in Xinjiang? I have opinion on the extradition of Nicolas Maduro, but I don't really, live in Venezuela.
It's funny. A lot of people with opinions on Gaza and Palestine really wouldn't enjoy Gaza and Palestine is the best way I could put that.
Exactly. I think I'm entitled to have an opinion, number one, as just being a man of the West and formulating ideas and ideologies. But number two, if the Jewish state represents Jewish people, which I've been in meetings with the prime minister and meetings with the president, and they very much do believe that they have a responsibility not merely to the nation state of Israel, but to Jews worldwide. If they believe that to be the case, then certainly I have a right and I'm entitled to have opinions on Israel. Again, I don't really talk about it publicly just because I think the optics will be bad and people will yell at me, and I don't want to be yelled at more than I already am. But I think it's misguided to simply say, well, you're an American Jew, so stay in your lane. And by the way, without the support of the diasporic community, Israel would be in a much tougher position. And of course, Bibi knows that, which is why he's trying to revamp how Israel receives foreign aid. But I digress. In terms of my political evolution of sorts, in a nutshell, because I can really talk about this ad nauseum. I mean, this is an evolution I'm still on, to be fair. Number one, I'm still a registered Democrat. I think part of that is because I'm a New York City resident and I want to be the first one to vote against Zohar Mamdani in the primary 4 years from now. But part of it is also, to sort of paraphrase Colin Powell, when he was asked, why are you still a Republican? He basically said, because I know it annoys them, because it basically forces the Republican Party to recognize that there are people like me who exist in the party. So too, on an ideological level, not really practical anymore, but on an ideological level, it forces the Democratic Party to recognize there are like pro-Israel, pro-capitalist, mainstream American Jews in the Democratic Party. As I said, it's more of like a wish than a practice because the Democratic Party has moved so dramatically to the left since Donald Trump's reelection. But number one, I'm still a registered Democrat. Number two, as you said in the intro, I testified in front of Congress a couple of times. Every single time I testified, I did not show an inch of political favoritism because actually at that point I was still a liberal. So if I was going to show favoritism, it would be the Democratic Party. And whether it was Jerry Nadler, whether it was Bobby Scott, who were the ranking Democratic members on separate committees, who scorned us for testifying, who said they're not going to be lectured about anti-Semitism, who said we're going to focus on all forms of hate. How come we're not focusing on Islamophobia, and sexism, and misogyny? And again, I told you, I marched for Black Lives Matter. If someone had dared suggested that all lives matter We would say, yeah, it's true, but right now we're focusing on Black lives because they're the ones facing racism and systemic oppression or whatever. And those same people who would skin you for saying all lives matter, they're the first ones to say there's no such thing as anti-Semitism. You mean anti-Semitism and Islamophobia? This really long made-up word. They're just physically unable, mentally unable to discuss anti-Semitism without all lives mattering the issue. We could talk about how at my before I get to that, I had meetings with Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader at the time, and he lied to us. He lied to our faces repeatedly, saying that he would bring the Deterrent Act, which would regulate and rescind the foreign contributions given to American campuses. He said he'd bring it to a floor vote, and he never did. And he kept making excuses. I mean, they just blatantly lied to us. When I was asked to speak at the Republican convention, I said no, because I didn't want to, be a political hack. I felt it was really important to remain either nonpartisan or bipartisan. And I won't mention who, but it was actually a Democrat who convinced me that I had to do it because that person said you would be foolish to be given a platform in front of millions of people, including a potential next president of the United States, and not talk about issues that are important to you. That's foolish. A Democrat told me that. And so when I gave my speech, you could watch the speech. I actually gave it 2 years ago today. I mentioned Trump's name once, and it's in passing. It's in third person. I don't endorse him. And the Trump campaign is furious. I think what, was final nail in the coffin was Kamala Harris, because I thought she was just an existential threat. But point being, to paraphrase Ronald Reagan, I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me. Now they have celebrated and elected people like Chevalier, I'm butchering her name, but Chevalier, the DSA member from Washington Heights, who says she wraps her hands with the American flag. They have voted for, celebrated, and have actually are going to send to Congress people who said we should abolish prisons, we should abolish borders, we should abolish Israel, we should abolish ICE. This is not, normative politics or, we disagree about the tax rate. These are like existential questions on the future of the West. When you have policymakers who actually don't support the West, who want to reform it in their own image, that's really dangerous for our democracy. And I will continue to support policy over party, policy over person. And it happens to be that the policies that I'm most in favor of are coming almost exclusively from the Republican Party. And I'll just add, because I'm sorry, I know I give long answers. I apologize.
No, it's good.
But I talk quickly, so I overcompensate. Very, very quickly, you might be asking, or you might be thinking, either you or the audience, what about the anti-Semitism on the right? I'm very proud of the fact that Nick Fuentes hates me. I'm proud of the fact that Candace Owens hates me. I'm proud of the fact that Tucker Carlson hates me. I'm proud of the fact that my president, President Trump, has repeatedly repudiated these individuals, saying they have no part in the MAGA verse. They have no part in the Conservative Party, in the Republican Party. That's really good, because fundamentally the difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party today is Republicans reject, Democrats elect. Republicans have rejected their crazies. Thomas Massie is no longer in office. Margaret Taylor Greene is no longer in office. That's because we don't like conspiratorial thinking. We don't like blaming your societal problems, your financial woes on something the Jews. We don't like that. We reject them. The Democrats keep electing them. That's not my conservative talking point. That's the data. That's the new Democrats who keep getting elected post Donald Trump. A disproportionate amount of the majority are DSA, Democratic Socialists of America.
Shabbos, I'll wrap, but that's fascinating. I'll wrap by asking and circling back to campus life and just what your advice or sort of do's don'ts would be for not just Jewish students and parents, but anybody who wants to go to campus and have a university education like we discussed. Obviously, there's a buyer beware. There's a brand that a few of these universities in Canada have that is affixed to them right now, that they aren't doing enough. They're exactly the type of school that you identified well on the campus of Harvard. Obviously, not going to those schools hurts their bottom line, hurts their funding per student, hurts their wallet in the long term. But that's going to take a while. That's pretty baked in terms of commitments to schools and whatnot. What's advice for an 18-year-old? We all remember being that age, going to campus, getting nervous about your roommate, the floor you'd be on, the professors you'd get. These are huge decisions that parents and kids have to make, isn't it?
They're huge decisions. So I want to make two kind of philosophical points. I am a pseudo-intellectual, of course, so you'll bear with me, and then I'll give you like a concrete answer. Number one, I think it's really important that the Jewish people recognize that Jews have been around for 3,000 years, and we will be around for the next 3,000 years. We have outlasted the Byzantines, the Romans, the Persians, the Greeks, the Egyptians. We will continue to be innovative and resourceful and creative because it's who we are. It's just what we do. Jews fundamentally don't need Harvard. It is Harvard that needs Jews. And if Harvard insists on accepting a radical, loud minority of students who, again, burn American flags, who shut down campuses, who set up homeless shelters in the middle of campus, then you can do that. That's your prerogative. But we're out. We're not endorsing this. And we have seen that the American people have been voting with their feet. We have seen that there are excellent universities. There are 6,000 universities in the United States. In the Jewish community, we obsess over like 6, but there are 6,000. And we have seen that there are excellent universities: Vanderbilt, Chicago, Princeton, University of Miami, University of Florida, Texas A&M, Georgia Tech, University of Michigan, that they don't just tolerate or accept or put up with Jews. They love them and welcome them and want them to be, as I said earlier, the best version of them that they can be. They want to amplify and celebrate their values and have an environment and a culture whereby you're not complaining on Fox News every week because some idiot drew another swastika, but you're excelling in whatever your academic and field is, whatever your passions and interests are. That's why you go to college. It's not to fight back. What an insane worldview that only we Jews have. Can you imagine telling black kids in 11th and 12th grade, go to the most racist school you can find and fight back? That's suicidal. That's insanity. Because you would tell black people instead, you have an incredible culture. You have a rich tradition and history, and you should go to a campus where those things are welcomed and you can grow and you can be the best version of you that you can be. But Jews, we take this mindset of go to the most anti-Semitic universities and fight back. What a waste of 4 years of your life. That's a terrible way of thinking about your role in society, of I constantly just need to fight people. So that's number one. Number two, in terms of the practicalities. So as I said, I really have a tremendous soft spot for the Canadian Jewish community. I hope you guys invite me, and I like being with you guys. Toronto, Montreal. I've been to Hamilton. I think I've even been to Winnipeg. So that's that's not many.
That's
Americans
out there. That's
can
out
say
there.
that.
Yes.
That's out there. So please, I hope the people watching will consider me a friend of the Canadian Jewish community and also a friend of HRC Charitable. That's number two. I would say this. Go to universities where whatever your particular interests are, science, technology, medicine, whatever, where that is number one. Because that should ultimately be why you go to college. Now, you also have to recognize that, Jewish life is important. Your values should never be compromised. You should not deliberately put yourself in a position where you're going to have to acquiesce or placate or pretend to be something that you're not. So make sure there's strong Jewish life there. There's a Chabad, there's presence, there's a way in which you can live a conducive Jewish life. But also make sure that all the reasons you want to go to college are why you're going to that particular college. I think it's so destructive to the psyche of a young person, whether they're Jewish or not, to tell them that you have to define the next 4 years of your life by people who don't like you. That's really destructive. And by the way, maybe on a theological sense, if the whole shtick about being Jewish post-October 7th is people hate us, so we got to stick together, well, pardon my French, but F that. Being Jewish sounds terrible. I'd rather just not be Jewish, and then I don't have to worry about the people not liking us. I love being Jewish because I'm a descendant of Abraham and Moses and David and the Maccabees. And my people split seas and moved mountains. That is an awesome story. And I want to tell that story. And yes, sometimes I have to deal with anti-Semitism, but not anti-Semitism in and of itself. I have to deal with it only insofar as it prevents me from telling that story and from living my values and practicing the things I believe in. And, the Lubavitch Rebbe made this point 40 years ago, where he basically said Jews were not put on this earth to combat anti-Semitism. And, maybe I'll make a political point. Anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem because most Jews aren't really anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism is an everybody else problem. Racism is not a black people problem because most blacks aren't really racist. It's a white people problem. White people have to focus on it. And I would much rather young Jews in Canada focus on how they will be living a loud, proud, public, confident, and enthusiastic Jewish life and not worrying as much about people not liking you.
Yeah, we've seen that with the Walk for Israel in Toronto, massive numbers. We've seen that. Obviously, you've seen it in New York City as well, where it is, it doesn't have to just be one weekend or one day or one moment where that happens. And find your allies on those campuses as well. They're there. There's a lot of people that want to go to school, look after each other. They don't want conflict. They don't want anger. They don't want protests. They don't want signs making anybody feel unwelcome. It's not really the university experience I think we sign up for or that we pay for. I can't thank you enough for your time, and I can't thank you enough for your energy and your opinion. And I so enjoyed this conversation. I'll turn this back over to Amanda to close us out. Amanda.
Thank you, Shabbos, for sharing your insights and your experiences with us this evening. Your words to Canadian students, I think, were especially valuable. And thank you, Greg, for leading such a thought-provoking discussion. We'd also like to thank all of you for joining us and for your commitment to engaging with these important issues. On behalf of HR Canada Charitable Organization, thank you for being part of this conversation, and we hope you'll join us again for future educational programs. Have a wonderful evening.